This is our 60th lesson, and I know this seems like a lengthy study, but this is so important because we get into all kinds of aspects of the universe and the Earth itself. We have to answer the arguments that atheists make, and I believe that the flood actually answers most of their geologic arguments. So this is our lesson 60. We'll probably have another, we'll probably end this somewhere around the end of the year this year. But I will take the class as long as it takes to finish the book, right? And we'll go that. However many, if we just have one student, we'll still do it, record it. Okay. We're going to look at misrepresented calculations. Right. Many of the methods used to calculate the age of the universe, or the sun, or the earth, or the moon, give upper limits of the age, not absolute proofs of the age of the universe, sun, earth, moon, and so forth. We need to understand when we date things, sometimes we have a problem with how we're dating them or how we're measuring time. I have no problem with the atheist in his calculations if he would state his assumptions and the age he has calculated from these assumptions, if he let us know what he's assumed, and realize that sometimes he's making assumptions and those assumptions may or may not be true. We can challenge his assumptions. Right. Now, let me back up just a moment before I go into this. I could tell you, if I told you that my father was born in 1898, in which he was, then you could say, well, he probably couldn't have fathered you until, maybe 1910 when he's 12 or 13 years old. Probably couldn't have fathered a child until he was about 12 years old or older, somewhere thereabouts. And so that would be probably the minimum age that he could have been to father me. So you would say that I can guarantee that Marion, since his father was born in 1898, was born after or during 1910 or thereafter sometime. But that makes sense. All right. So it's a rough age. And so if you have the time frame, then you can look at it and you can draw a conclusion that I was born at least after 1910 or somewhere thereabouts. And you can draw that conclusion. So you would date me as being no older than 112 years old, right? That wouldn't say that I was 112 years old, which I'm not, but you could say the oldest I could be would be 112. And so we have a relative age. And so that's one of the assumptions we have to understand. So a lot of the ages and the times, the dates they give are relative dates relative to something else. Are there questions or comments? Okay. No. The first example is a calculation of the age of the artifact by radiocarbon dating assumes the radiocarbon in the biosphere. And this would be, radiocarbon goes into living organisms, see? That's where they use it to measure the organism. The atmosphere of the land and the sea has been constant. They assume it's been constant. Why? Well, because the rate of decay is a different mathematical relationship than the rate of buildup. And so it's like this, and I illustrated it once before, and again, it's a good illustration. If you had a water tank that was deep enough, and you had a small pipe at the bottom of the water tank, and water can flow out of it, but you were pumping water in at a certain rate, a constant rate. But the deeper the water gets, the greater the water pressure on that orifice, the pipe at the bottom of the tank. So as the pressure gets greater, the flow of water through that pipe at the bottom increases, because the flow is determined by the size of the orifice, the opposition it has to flow, and the pressure. As the pressure builds up, it comes out faster. And so it would eventually, if you had the tank deep enough and you could actually have it to where the inflow and the outflow was the same. The outflow would be logarithmic or exponential, because as the pressure builds up, the flow increases. Whereas the flow into the pipe it's a constant flow. And the assumption is radiocarbon is built up on a constant rate. And of course, we've shown that that's not necessarily true. But what we have here is, if they've assumed that to be the case, and it should have reached a point at which the decay and the production were equal. That's called equilibrium. That's what we mean by equilibrium. They're equal. And they should have been at equilibrium. In fact, they should reach equilibrium in less than 100,000 years. Okay? So they're not at equilibrium. And that tells us something right there. The claim has been disproven by a number of facts, some of which we presented in this book and in our studies. And so they're not at equilibrium. They should be, but they're not. And they should be if the Earth is billions of years old, even millions of years old, they should be, but they're not. That's pretty solid evidence against their claim of the age of the Earth. The second example is out of dating atmosphere. Many atheists assume that the original atmosphere of the Earth was lost by some means, then was replenished by the outgassing from the interior of the planet. And so we have here, the claim is that the solar wind and other sources, energy gain, molecules of gas, cause it to be expelled from the Earth and liberated, or it flies, gets enough kinetic energy to fly off into space and be lost. And so the claim is that it's been removed from the interior of the Earth. That's the claim they're making, and they assume that to be the case. Why? Well, they know we're losing atmosphere, and so they project that backwards, and they use it usually in linear extrapolation, which we've already talked about. And when they do, they come back and they should have lost all the atmosphere if the planet is 4.5 billion years old. And so by outgassing from the Earth, the interior of the Earth itself, make that assumption. Say, Broadhurst claims that this did not occur. We're going to get a quote of most of these men I'm quoting are probably atheists or agnostics. They're certainly not known to be theists or believers in God. And I don't quote theists very much, not because I don't trust them, because they claim I'm quoting biased sources. I believe that there are theists that have made good arguments, but I'm not citing them, not because I don't believe them, because I want to cite the people that are not believers where they admit the truth. Okay, planetary scientists, that's Broadhurst, have long known activity from gases produced inside the planet to reach the surface. They're worried about the production of carbon dioxide, and yet vast amounts of carbon dioxide are by volcanoes almost constantly. And so there's a tremendous amount of production of carbon dioxide. Most of the carbon dioxide produced by volcanoes don't have carbon-14 anymore, very little carbon-14. Well, so we read on. Given this process called volcanic degassing could create an atmosphere on a terrestrial planet. But recent laboratory research has cast doubt on whether volcanic activity by itself could create the present atmospheres belonging to the terrestrial planets. Now then, the problem with it is the various gases we have in our planet, in our atmosphere, would not be produced by this. That's the problem. That's what Broadhurst is saying. He continues, that's on page 40. In addition, the atheist assumes that all the argon in the atmosphere was generated by radioactive decay. He assumes that the decay of radioactive isotopes is constant, not affected by external influences. Now, this gets another question about that. if the atheist would freely admit his assumption to be evidence that he's guilty of circular reasoning. He's reasoned in a circular pattern. And so we see that circular reasoning. We can see it. If we look at their arguments, we can see logical fallacies. I'm convinced I haven't read any argument made against the existence of God by any atheist that I've read that didn't contain a logical fallacy. They may beg the question, they may assume, or they may even commit simple fallacies like denying the antecedent or affirming the consequent. Now, the third example is that the age of the sun is calculated from the amount of helium and hydrogen in the sun. They assume that the hydrogen is by a process of nuclear fusion, and that's the process by which a hydrogen bomb occurs, has produced helium. That's the assumption. Assume that no helium existed in the sun at its beginning. And of course, they can't prove that. They just have assumed it. Did God create the sun with no helium, or was helium part of it? If helium was part of it, then all this dating is fallacious. You see, they assumed it had no helium. That's an assumption, and they can't prove that assumption. Of course, it's not scientific to begin with, because they're not looking at, it's not empirical knowledge. They haven't verified it by empirical means. They haven't gone back in time to see how much hydrogen and helium there was 4 billion or 5 or 10 or 15 billion years ago, whatever the time of the age of the sun they're postulating. What these calculations obtain is the maximum age of the sun if these calculations are correct and if these assumptions are true. So again, we have the assumptions are there, and they can't prove the assumptions. And they made the assumption, and without the assumption, if the assumption is not true, their whole argument falls apart. In fact, if their assumption is not true, if there was abundance of helium in the sun originally, when it was created by God, then the sun would be young, not old. So again, they have to assume there was none there, or very little, if none, and then that all of it's been produced by the decay, what we know as fusion. And so hydrogen fusion of hydrogen atoms together to make helium. Gribben states, so the Big Bang model tells us that there was a period of about 200 seconds in which neutrons, which were originally as abundant as protons, were decaying without being replaced. So neutrons were decaying, and they were abundant as protons. Well, that's an assumption they make according to their model. And they weren't being replaced. If neutrons had a very short lifetime, all the neutrons from the Big Bang would have decayed in a 20-second gap, 200-second gap. There would be no deuterium. Originally, when the chemists studied the chemicals, they didn't identify it correctly. And what they did is they went by weight, and they found that there was some material that had basically twice the weight of hydrogen. And so they called it deuterium. But all it was an isotope of hydrogen. That is, it had a proton in the nucleus and a neutron, and of course an electron. And so they called it deuterium. And of course, that's an isotope of hydrogen. It's still hydrogen because it only has one electron, one proton. It's just an isotope of it. And then there's tritium, which has 3 particles in the nucleus, two neutrons and 1 proton. They call it tritium, tritium. And so right here, let's go back here. And he says, if neutrons had a very short lifetime, all the neutrons of the Big Bang would have decayed in the 20-second gap, and there would be no deuterium. All right? That isotope of hydrogen wouldn't exist. No helium, because you have to have deuterium to fuse together to get helium, according to their theory, and no heavy elements in the universe today. The problem we run into is they don't have a mechanism to produce the heavy elements, gold and silver and stuff like that. lead and things of that nature, the heavier elements. And no, even no heavy elements in the universe today. If neutrons had a very long lifetime, most of them would have survived. Virtually all the primordial nuclear material would have been processed into helium. So it would have been processed into helium. The problem here with it, the spectra of the light from old stars, and again, they're dating stars by how many light years they are away. We've already talked about the universe and the method of dating it by distance of light years. A light year is a distance that it takes light to travel in 1 year. At 186,000 miles per second, that's a distance, a measurement of distance. But of course, there's three kinds of geometry. There's Euclidean geometry, which is normally taught in our public schools, and that's what most people have studied. There's Riemannian geometry, and then there's elliptical geometry, three different forms of geometry. On a short scale, all three get the same answer. But if you go out longer distances, they get different answers. Depends on the nature of the universe itself. Now, Albert Einstein, in his theory of relativity, of course, he had a special theory and a general theory, but in his theory of relativity, he assumed that space was Riemannian and not Euclidean. And so his assumptions are based upon Riemannian space. But Riemannian space, the furthest you could be, it would be about 16 years of time. Space is a curve, not linear like we think of Euclidean geometry, according to Einstein. So that poses a problem. We've already brought that up and discussed that in prior lessons. I'll bring that up again. So we got a problem here. Gribben says we got troubles with it, with all of our theories. Now, I will illustrate relative age, as I've already done. My father was born in 1898. And if you assume he's at least 10 years old when I was conceived, then I could not have been born before 1908. And so I would have had to have been born after 1908. And so I was born after 1908. Now, that's all you can say. You can't say I was born in 1908 because it's not true. Okay? I was born in 1943. My father was about 45 years old when I was born. Okay, so we have to understand relative age and be careful of it. Let's look at Petrified Forest. And I have a friend that did a tremendous amount of study on this. And I was going to get all his material, but he's kind of lost it. His computer crashed, and I don't have it anymore. But I was going to take his research and try to springboard with it a little bit. But Petrified Forest, they prove the Earth is old. The assumption has been made that it takes millions of years to petrify wood. And now they've discovered that's not true. Right? They're under the right condition, petrification can occur very quickly. In Yellowstone National Park, and if you haven't been there, you need to go there because it's a beautiful place. However, it is a volcano, basically, is what it is. In Yellowstone National Park, mostly in the state of Wyoming, northwest corner, there are several layers of rock that have petrified trees in the rock formations. Let's look at some petrification. This is a picture that I took in Arizona. These are petrified trees. This is logs of petrified wood. And it's probably the same tree that was petrified. Right? That's a photograph. Here's me. This is several years ago, but I'm in front of one of these petrified logs. That's me there. Incidentally, that's an Oklahoma State University cap on that I was wearing. And I took my sunglasses off. All right, so that's me right there. All right. So that's at the Petrified Forest in Arizona, the state of Arizona in the United States. And of course, that's a pretty big log, but it's petrified, and you can see it. They show it. Now then, this gets into some information about petrified wood. I know as a boy, I found petrified wood all over my father's ranch in various places. We'd find it in the lying on the ground, petrified rocks. And they were petrified wood. It was just everywhere. It wasn't just in Arizona, but it was all over the place. I saw it. And there was so much of it, I just quit picking it up. It was just everywhere. Specimen Ridge, this is in Yellowstone National Park, which outcrop 2,000 feet above the plateau. That will be 610 meters, my calculation now. Above the plateau extend for 20 miles or 32 kilometers. I put kilometers on here because we have some people that view this and use the metric system, so I did that for that reason. Along the Lamar River and include strata, which contains some of the most remarkable petrified trees in the park. Now, this is a statement here. Many superposed layers of upright petrified trunks, no less than 15 according to Dalton, and he recorded this in 1899, appear to indicate that in the past geologic time a succession of forests flourished, all repeatedly covered with volcanic ash and lava. Now, Bayer says we have these layers of petrified trunks. They were petrified, and then they're buried, and then there's petrified and layers above them. So the assumption is that this was done over a period of millions of years, or at least hundreds of thousands of years, large lengths of time, and repeatedly covered with volcanic ash and lava. That was the assumption here, see. The layers in which these trees are found contain the trees in several positions, some of which are upright, some are horizontal, and some are diagonal, tilted at an angle. The atheistic interpretation is that these trees are a number of different forests that were covered by volcanic debris. Now, when I say atheistic, I say also the old earth creationist view as well. There are people that claim creation occurred, but that God caused it by theistic evolution, or that we have the age of the earth is still billions of years old. They use the day age or the gap theories. I believe all of these theories are false. Okay? But we'll not have time to look at all of them. We're not getting into the creation. We're looking at the flood here in our study. Trees are dated by tree rings to be several hundred years old. So they have tree rings on them. If you cut through them, you can see the rings. If there are 15 layers of rock with petrified trees in each layer, the assumption is made there must have been 15 volcanic eruptions. That's the assumption. But again, it's only an assumption. Could be a series of volcanic eruptions that occurred over a period of a few days. I believe and I'm convinced that during the flood, there were volcanic eruptions that occurred during the flood, and that these occurred because of the nature of the flood and the mechanism that brought it, and I believe planetary action and the action of the planet coming close to the Earth and interaction of the gravity fields and lifting of the magma, lifting of the crust of the Earth and so forth, caused volcanic eruptions. These forests assumed to be several hundred years old each, or then multiplied by 15 to get about 5,000 years. So we have several hundred years, 15 of them, 300 years each, or somewhere thereabouts, 300 or 400 years. Out of 500 years, it gets you about 5,000 years. The atheist then claims this proves the Earth's older than 6,000 years. Okay? And again, it's a relative age. But what is he assumed? He has assumed that all of these layers were laid, and then a time occurred, and then there was another eruption later. He has made that assumption. He has assumed that it took long periods of time for this petrification to occur. If these were deposited during the flood, it dates the flood at least 5,000 to 6,000 years after the first forest was destroyed, according to them. So they claim that the dating of the flood had to have been earlier than what we give it. If this were deposited after the flood, it dates the flood at about 5,000, 6,000 years before the last forest was destroyed. Right? North claims that there were 27 different forests that were covered, page 106, 108. He estimates that it took 20,000 years to cover the 27 forests, for new forests to grow and then cover them again. Of course, what is he assuming? He's assuming that it wasn't done during the flood, and he's making that assumption. We're going to look at it very carefully here. Remember, he's assuming it took 1,000 years. But I want you to notice something. We're going to notice something about the trees that are in this, that are petrified trees that we find here, and with the nature of the trees. Because we're going to find that we've had trees that are from temperate climate, subtropical, and tropical climates, all three. So are we to assume that in 20,000 year period of time, that this region there in the Yellowstone Park went from temperate climate to subtropical to tropical and back to temperate, back and forth in a 20,000 year period? And that's really climate change in its ultimate. That's what that is. Fritz discusses the stratigraphic framework of this section of the Yellowstone National Park, 1980A, pages 1 through 18. He concludes, due to the complex alluvial system responsible for deposition of the Lamar River Formation, it is impossible to determine the number of layers of forest or to tell how many times surrounding volcanoes erupted. So he says it's not possible to even determine this, how many layers there were. So again, one fella, probably an atheist, but certainly is not known to be a theist. These guys disagree among themselves. Coffin, a man named Coffin, does not list anywhere near 15 layers. Coffin says on Specimen Ridge only 2 levels contain sufficient prostate logs for measurements. One of the two with only 3 specimens. Mount Norris yielded 2 adequate levels of prostrate logs, although one level contained only 2 specimens that had not been included in the text. Measurements were taken on 3 levels in the fossil forest. So now he gets 3, only 3 levels. Again, that's far from 20, as some of them have claimed. When Mount St. Helens in Washington State erupted on May the 18th, 1980, and I remember that occurring, extensive mud flows carried whole forests to regions below the peak. These trees were deposited in various positions, some upright, some horizontal, and some diagonal. In all these different types of positions. These trees were deposited in layers almost identical to those at Yellowstone. Fritz discusses this extensively with a number of photographs of it. So that's Mount St. Helens shot them down, a lot of their arguments down. After the eruption of Mount St. Helens, geologists had to change a number of ideas about the deposition of sediment. And they had hard evidence because they knew this had been laid and saw it laid. So this is good science because they actually saw it with empirical means. That's what science is about. They actually saw these being deposited and they were visible and they saw it occur. They know when it occurred, how much time it took to occur, just a matter of a few days. The manner that the petrified wood is found in Yellowstone is in total harmony with what one would expect from logs that were transported great distances and deposited on mountains or were formed by volcanic eruptions, like we saw at Mount St. Helens. The logs are oriented in the same direction. These logs are oriented in the same direction as like they would if they were moving in water. In many instances, the stumps are deposited upright in many instances. Coffin, 1983, page 298, cites a number of sources that have been observed upright stumps, even trees floating in the ocean in streams and in lakes. Trees then are floating around upright, and there'll be rocks in their roots, and the rocks are giving them like ballast in a ship to make it float. And the tree then floats upright in the lake or in the sea or even in the ocean in the streams. Petrified trees of Yellowstone are without bark. They don't have any bark on them. Why is that? That's peculiar. If you go back to those trees that I showed with the picture of me, it had bark on it. And we see the petrification of the bark. But the petrified trees in Yellowstone are without bark, and it's peculiar for trees such as the great sequoia tree, what we call the redwoods. Commonly, the wood, Fritz tells us, has been coated with mud and of a composition similar to the matrix of a mud flow conglomerates, So there was like a mud flow. The bark has generally not been preserved, a peculiar condition for trees like sequoia with thick, resistant bark. So the bark is gone. Well, how would that occur? So the bark would conform to the contention that these trees were deposited, transported great distances, and the trees, by their rolling motion and incessant rubbing against other trees, lost their bark. That would make perfectly good sense. The bark come off as the trees rolled around and moved in the floodwaters, the turbulent floodwaters. In addition, the trees are identified as being tropical, subtropical, and temperate origin. And of course, Fritz and other sources that I've cited tell us that. So again, we ask the question, how did we get all of those different kinds of trees in this location over a short period of just a few thousand years' time? And of course, that's rapid climate change, according to the view that it must hold, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Wheeler tells us more than 100 species of fossil plants, 75% of them, told us, have been identified from beds along the Lamar River, chiefly from leaves and finer sediments of the formation containing the fossil trees. These leaf flora have predominantly warm-tempered and subtropical amenities, but includes forms of monorhabdids in the tropics. This is Wheeler. And so he dates these and tells us what non-trees are: temperate, subtropical, and tropical. So we find all kinds of these trees. Well, again, this would fit the flood model, but it won't fit his model, their model. Most identification of the fossil trees from the leaves and pollen. Now, my one claim to fame in biology is I took a graduate course in botany, and it was about common trees. I took a class called Common Trees of Oklahoma. Of course, we dated trees by various things, the fruit and the bark and the leaves and so forth. And so we dated them by different ways, a combination of these things, pollen, leaves, and other things. Some fossils, Wheeler tells us, goes on, are assignable to extant genera, others to families, still others cannot be reliably placed in any extant taxa. So they're from trees we don't know anything about. Most of the information on palingene plants comes from the study of leaves and pollen rather than the wood. So they're looking at leaves and pollen rather than the wood. Okay. We may have trees that became extinct during the flood. You just don't know. Other proof that the trees are from different climates is the presence and absence of growth rings of various types of growth rings. Now, trees that live near the equator, their growth rings are not like they are in temperate regions. In Oklahoma, the deciduous trees drop their leaves in the winter and are not growing. So the growth process slows down because the leaves are not there to produce things to cause the plant to grow. So we see the hibernation basically of the tree itself during winter. And so we get the tree rings, narrow and thicker rings. Some of the woods have well-defined growth rings with marked changes in vessel diameter. That's like you'd have arrangement within the growth ring. The species of Lauraceous wood, however, lacks distinct growth rings, a characteristic not associated with temperate regions. Oklahoma is a temperate region, so the leaves drop off, the trees kind of go into like hibernation. And they are not having leaves to cause them to grow. Whereas you get in a tropical region or a subtropical region, they don't drop their leaves and they continue to grow even what we would say is wintertime. In a later article, Wheeler et al. State two of the woods, Credoxon, a Eocene system, and Prunus gumosa, that's not like a gum tree, have structural features, shimmering porosity, and a spiral thickenings, respectively, which are generally found in the extent representatives that grow in higher latitudes. That was probably like our gum trees. In contrast, Terpenia mosi have distinct growth rates and characteristics considered to be indicative of more tropical conditions. So again, they can look at trees and tell trees that grow in the tropics by their growth ring patterns being different than those that grow in temperate regions. It makes perfectly good sense. We can actually see the trees, we watch them grow and look at their tree rings right now. Trees, we watch them grow and they grow up. We know that tree's 30 years old, they cut it down, look at the growth rings. So they can tell this by the various trees that we see. And so this is perfectly good science. It's easily explained by a tidal flood, which brought the different types of trees together, but is not easily explained by uniformitarian geology. Again, my tidal flood model fits it quite well. But the evidence set forth in this chapter, it's evident that the universe, that would be the sun, the earth, and the moon, are quite young, not old like we see people claiming. There's no compelling evidence that proves the universe, everything in it, is over a few thousand years old. All right. Now, do you have any questions?